While we're letting everybody in, we just want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. And also we'll talk about it again, but you can answer or have questions and enter them in the Q&A section down below. And we will go ahead and get those answered. By whichever party that's going to be answering those questions. So feel free to start adding if you already have any questions, and we will go ahead and kind of get started. I'm going to share a screen with you all, and we will go ahead and start some little bit housekeeping while people kind of come in and do a little bit of intros. We want to start off first of all and go a little few housekeeping items. We want to be respectful and kind throughout the presentation to the people who have agreed to speak and share with us. Like I said, feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box at any time. You do have an opportunity for your question to appear as anonymous just by clicking those three dots, and it'll bring up those options down by the Q&A box. We will be try to address all questions during the dedicated Q&A session. If those questions don't get answered, we do have a contact us page at the very end. Depending on which item you have a question for, we have a dedicated email you can send those to. An FYI, the chat function has been disabled to allow our team who's fielding these questions to focus on the questions in one comprehensive place. After this presentation, this webinar will be translated and made available to those who feel comfortable reading this in their chosen language. And like I said, my name is Frankie Hermosillo, and I am a senior economic developer with the City of Albuquerque Economic Development. I work with our small business office. We call it SBO. And we will be joined today from a couple of people from our department. We have the Department for Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, BFDs Valencia, will be talking about their department and how they can help or add any additional information. So make sure and keep that. This presentation will also be available. We have a QR code towards the end of it. And this whole presentation with all of the links will be made available to everybody should you have any questions. So with that, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sonia Lara with the Office of Equity and Inclusion.
Thank you so much, Frankie. I'm so glad to be here today with each of you, business leaders, community members. I just want to thank you for joining us for today's important conversation on immigration. As Frankie mentioned, my name is Sonia Lara, and I have the great privilege of serving as the Director of the Office of Equity and Inclusion for the City of Albuquerque. And so on behalf of our city, I want to take a moment just to recognize the 19 pueblos, those 4 nations, as stewards of this land before statehood. I also acknowledge the 12 million enslaved Africans who were violently taken from their lands to endure forced labor. You know, it's with these acknowledgements but I feel so honored to hold space with you today, aware and united of our shared struggle towards equity and inclusion for all people in the city that we love. So as you know, as we know, our city is a place of resilience, of opportunity, of belonging. And these values guide our teams in the Office of Equity and Inclusion and all of the city of Albuquerque, our work daily to support immigrants, refugees, just anyone who calls Albuquerque home. So in today's webinar, we're here to share with you vital resources. We're here, as Frankie mentioned, to answer your questions and to ensure that each of you leaves this webinar feeling informed and confident in the knowledge that we share. And to that end, it's my honor to introduce our distinguished guests. We are pleased to have Rachel Lazar here with us from El Centro. We're also grateful to have Chuck Sheldon with us also to answer questions. And really, I'm excited to introduce someone deeply committed to this work, the courageous leader who instituted the Office of Equity and Inclusion for the City of Albuquerque. So if you could please join me in welcoming our Mayor, Tim Keller.
Thanks so much for that wonderful welcome, and I really appreciate it. And it's wonderful to see this office actually in action in all sorts of cases, but also in many ways in our time of need, which we know when we first came into office, it was in many ways because of the child separation issues that were happening at the border. And here we are again 7 years later with more opportunities for us to step up and be there for our entire city, including our immigrant community and businesses who work with our immigrant community. So my role here today is really just to kick things off. The experts, and they are the right experts, are with us today. And so I'm just going to start by touching on a few issues. And I think first and foremost, I get a lot of questions about our city's immigrant-friendly policy, and we're here to really focus on businesses, which obviously that a policy doesn't really apply because it's a policy that affects city government. But I do want to explain that just for a moment. And the way that works is basically anyone at the city, anyone who works at the city, a city employee, they're not allowed to ask the status of anyone's immigration level or situation, and they're not allowed to ask for documentation of any kind. So this means if you go to a community center or a library, no one's going to say, are you a citizen? You can't actually ask that under our policy. Now, that's what that policy does. It's actually quite succinct and simple in that regard. It also means that we don't track status because we don't ask for status. We also have no way to track status. So there is no database of, who went to a library and who was documented and of what kind and so forth. So that's why in many ways, what this means is the city is a safe place in numerous ways, but especially because there's no record keeping of anyone's history in general, let alone your immigration status. And also this applies to police and fire. So police officers are not allowed to ask for your immigration status. And they're also not allowed to track if they find out your immigration status. So this is how our policy works. It's actually that simple. Now, I will mention, because sometimes people ask me a sort of bizarre question that can come from this, which is, what about if someone's breaking the law? And the answer to that is, we treat everyone the same. If you're breaking the law, we're going to arrest you and we're going to hold you accountable. It doesn't matter your status, and we're not going to wait to check on your status before we take appropriate action. So just want to remind folks that yes, absolutely, if anyone is doing an illegal activity, that we will treat that situation the same way we would for anyone. So that immigrant-friendly status has sort of works two ways. It's certainly friendly because we're not questioning anyone's status, but it also means that we're going to function as a city regardless of your status. So now let's transition a little bit, because that's how the city works. The question that we get a lot of times, especially from businesses, is what are the different rules and how does this work? And what if ICE shows up and things like this? And we're going to go into that with the experts. But I think there's some things that are important to remember. We want to make sure, number one, that folks know that they have places to go or call for resources and to get answers to those questions. So part of what our Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs does is make sure that we connect people to the resources. So it could be like the Immigrant Law Center. It could be just small business support. It could be a number of things. But we're going to walk through the different resources that are available and how to reach out to them, including basics like a good phone number to call if you just have questions or if anything's happening. So that's one piece. I think the other piece that is interesting in many ways, especially for businesses, is just your rights in general. So one thing is we want people to know, look, you have rights as a business that you do like in any situation, but those also apply to if a form of law enforcement is coming to your place of work. So for example, if APD just barges into your business and you say whatever and they just push their way through and that kind of thing, and they're searching for all your stuff, that's illegal, right? They need a warrant. And that's the same with ICE. So they need a warrant signed by a judge to barge into private property. Now, again, this obviously in the context of immigration, we're talking about ICE and so forth, but I want to remind folks these are rights that we have anyway, right? That's why I used APD as an example, because again, APD would not be under our ordinance in any way working with ICE. But the point is, any entity that's trying to barge into your business that you don't have to let them in unless they have that warrant. Now, it's somewhat similar, and we'll walk through the nuances for information. So, in America today, somebody can't just find you on the street and say, give me all your personal information. They also have to have different legal cause and reasons to do that. So again, I'm just highlighting these are rights that we have in general in this country, mostly under the Bill of Rights, but they certainly apply in these situations to all forms of government and law enforcement, including ICE. And so that's what we're reminding folks of. And so I know this might sound a little confusing and we're going to walk through it. There's also some tough nuances because public spaces are deemed public spaces and people are all allowed to be in different public spaces. So this includes law enforcement, but it also includes each and every one of us. And so that's why when you think about certain things like a place that's certainly open to the public, like a park, the reality is ICE can be at a park. Of course they can. And so can immigrants or anyone else. Now, what transaction may take place between somebody from ICE and someone at a park are the legal nuances that we can talk about. But we just want to acknowledge that in all public spaces, of course, ICE is also legally to be allowed in any public space. So with more on this, it also depends on the kind of business you run. So, right, this is the other nuances. Is your business a public place or not? And I'm not going to continue my very rough legalese any further. What I'm going to do is tee that up as questions for our panelists and so forth, how you sort of distinguish between those two things and how you would, of course, work in those situations, depending on what your actual business is. But hopefully what I wanted to do is provide at least some context and also a little bit about how sort of this unfortunately may play out in your place of business. So I'll close with this. I also want folks to know why we have an immigrant-friendly policy and law in the city of Albuquerque. It's very important. And I also want folks to know that that is important for everyone to know. You may not even agree with that policy, and I understand that. It is city law, so we're going to follow it. But I think it's also important to understand like why it exists. And I would summarize it really with just two basic things. Number one is it is absolutely critical that everyone in our city has some level of trust in a city service, right? So I think we can agree as people, like we want to make sure that someone who's having a heart attack can call 911 and not worry that the fire department is going to share that there may be undocumented people in the house when they go try and save your life, right? I think all of us believe that would be a ridiculous, terrible thing for the fire department or for a city to do. So we don't do that. That is actually what the immigrant-friendly policy does. Now, I use the fire department because I think that's pretty straightforward, that the important thing there is to save someone's life. But think about that for other departments. Maybe it's the police department and they're just doing a welfare check. We want the same thing to be true. We want people to be comfortable talking to the police, our local police, without any fear of deportation, because we need them to tell us when things may be happening that are bad or illegal, like illegal drug dealing or like domestic violence is a very difficult issue. And we have to have somewhere for folks to get justice, no matter who they are, because we want that to keep our city safer. We need that trust for everyone in the city, including our immigrant community, to trust city services, including police, including fire, and including things like our early childhood centers, which are used heavily by our immigrant communities. And so we have to have that trust. And fundamental to that trust is confidence, knowing that our department is in no way, or our city is in no way working with ICE or tracking status of any kind. So that's the first reason. Second reason I think is a little bit more fundamental. And it's really just about the fact that I think we value in general our families. And we believe, I believe, that as a city and as a community, that we're better off if we have families that can stay together. And so what that means is no family should be afraid to go to the hospital or to go to church and worry about their uncle getting deported, or kids waiting for at school and no one picks them up because their parent got deported. That is both, I think, it's a huge moral problem. And I think that's why we should keep families together. And that's why our immigrant-friendly policy exists. I also believe that if you look at it in a more pragmatic perspective, when you tear families apart and you separate them, the burden to raise those kids in many ways falls on the community and the city. And so no matter how you look at it, you can look at it pragmatically or you can look at it morally. I think we're always better off keeping families together. So those are the two reasons for immigrant-friendly policy. And so with that, I'll hand it back over to our moderator.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the information you provided, and most importantly, for your support of the community. And thank you to everyone out here for joining us. So we'll go get started. As Mayor Keller mentioned, I will be your moderator. My name is Frankie Hermosillo, and I'm going to get to be your guide on this journey and introduce some really, really amazing people who's going to share some pretty helpful information. We went over the housekeeping items, and so we're going to blaze through that. And of course, we have to have a disclaimer. The information provided today is intended for general information and guidance on immigration-related businesses and tenant rights. Laws and policies are subject to change, and individual circumstances may vary. If you need information, please consult a qualified attorney and ask any questions that you may have. Moving on, I'm going to introduce you all to the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, and I'd like to introduce you to Beatriz Valencia, Immigrant and Refugee Liaison.
Thank you so much, Frankie. My name is Beatriz Valencia. I'm the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs Liaison for the City of Albuquerque. And I want to tell you that this office is inside the Office of Equity and Inclusion, and that we work together with all the other city departments to be able to help the community by sharing resources. Our mission is to be inclusive, that anyone in the city who is immigrant and refugee have the possibility to that through language access, through resource sharing, and coalition of partnerships, we're able to be successful. If you need any information about our office, please go to our website. Later on, those resources are going to be available. And there is also a lot of other information that are going to be available. And by the way, I just want to do a little plug. Tomorrow, we're going to have another webinar connected with the advocacy for the organizations that are going to be able to also to talk about this subject. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you. A little bit now going on for the Albuquerque Small Business Office. The Small Business Office, we call it the SBO. It's a division of the Economic Development Department. The Small Business Office was established in 2019 to support small businesses across the city of Albuquerque. We help by connecting small business owners with the right people and resources, assisting businesses in navigating city processes such as permitting and licensing, and helping businesses understand the city's procurement process and how to secure contracts. You can learn more at cabq.gov/SBO. Moving along, an overview of immigration policy and changes. With new federal immigration policies, which has caused us to want to do this presentation, small business owners and tenants have experiencing changes that affect hiring, compliance, and tenant protections. In his second term, President Donald Trump has enacted several significant changes to the U.S. immigration policy. The termination of temporary protected status, revocation of humanitarian parole programs, mass deportation initiatives, and executive orders on border security. Given the nature of these immigration policies, it's crucial for small business owners and tenants to stay informed through trusted sources. Regularly consult official government websites, reputable news outlets, and professional legal counsel. Today, we're going to discuss best practices in ensuring compliance while protecting your rights and those of your employees or tenants. I'd like to introduce you now to Keely. Keely is the staff attorney. Well, I'm going to go back here. Sorry, guys. At Organization for Public Interest Law, or OPIN, where she specializes in immigration law and employment compliance. Today, she's going to be providing valuable insights in the proper procedures for completing an I-9 form and best practices to ensure compliance with federal regulations. Keely?
Hi, good day, everyone. I'm not able to control my own camera, but I'm happy to get started. And yeah, okay, let's see. There we go. Start my video. Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to get on this call. My name is Keely Cieslik. I'm a staff attorney with Organized Power in Numbers, OPIN, and we are a national workers' rights organization. We focus on using data and digital tools to build worker power in the South and Southwest and to support campaigns that can reach millions of people. We partner with state, local, and national organizations to strengthen existing campaigns and run our own local campaigns that are focused on improving the lives of workers, whether they be at their workplaces or in communities. Our work includes housing justice campaigns, growing and strengthening union pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship pipeline programs with labor partners, and temp worker organizing across the Sun Belt. So as we prepare to defend immigrant workers, our team is ready to support rapid response projects with digital tools and other resources. And to that end, we're also committed to making sure that employers understand their rights and obligations. So I'm going to give you a brief overview. I cannot answer any specific legal questions on this call. And just to reiterate, this is not legal advice. I'm just providing information at this stage of this presentation. So specifically, I just want to give you an overview of what employers need to know about an I-9 audit. You might have heard of this before. It might bring up a lot of concern for you and or your employees, and we're going to talk about it at a high level. And we are available offline to help connect you to resources that and sort of engage more deeply in questions at the end of this, but not during the call. So what is an I-9 audit? An I-9 audit is when Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is a sub-agency within the Department of Homeland Security, investigates whether a workplace is in compliance with federal law that requires all people who are employed to have federal work authorization. And violations can result in fines and termination, forced termination of workers who have paperwork discrepancies. And less commonly, but certainly not impossible, and potentially more commonly going forward, it can result in ICE detaining workers or putting them into deportation proceedings. And it's called an I-9 audit, as many of you also may have, experience or lots of understanding of this process already, but because it involves verifying information on the I-9 form. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to briefly point you to the federal law that kind of then generates the authority for these audits. That's 8 USC 1324A, and then a specific subsection within that statute, and then 1324B. And these two statutes came about as a result of the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act. So that was a compromise where there was a federal commitment to providing a pathway to lawful status for many people who didn't have it at the time. But in exchange, it created much stricter federal law around the employment of people who may not have lawful immigration status, and in fact, made it unlawful to hire unauthorized workers that had not been sort of in our federal code before, and it became a part of the federal code as a part of that compromise. It also included very clear, and the statute contains companion anti-discrimination provisions. So even though it created requirements about work authorization, it also contains protections to try and mitigate potential national origin or other types of discrimination based on someone's identity. Next slide, please. All right, so the first statute, 1324A, makes it unlawful to knowingly hire or continue to employ an employee knowing that they lack work authorization. And there are fines associated with this. They vary. And the fines increase if I-9 auditors were to identify a pattern or practice of repeatedly knowingly hiring people without work authorization. The law also includes what is called a safe harbor, which is a component which says that if you show that you made a good faith effort to comply with I-9, the paperwork, then that's an affirmative defense to possibly being in a position of having employed people without work authorization. So the law also requires that an I-9 form is completed within 3 days of hiring someone. And it requires a process of verifying work authorization. And that process requires that employers review documents that establish work authorization, and then maintain copies of the I-9 document. It's important for employers to know that there is no requirement to maintain copies of the documents presented by employees to establish work authorization. So some employers do maintain those documents, some don't. There's no obligation to under the law, but what is important to note is that whatever your policy is, it needs to be uniform. It's important that you're not only retaining those documents for some segment or subsection of your workforce. Next slide, please. And then, like I said, there's this companion statute, which makes clear that it's unlawful to discriminate against employees or workers based on national origin or work just in general to be creating differences of treatment between work authorized non-citizens, citizens, or on any other basis in that area. And this portion of the statute also has civil penalties. And so these two things together are really meant to be a sort of a check and a balance on one another. Can't see the slides anymore. Is anyone else able to see the slide? Having difficulty seeing the slides. It might be, I've found that in Zoom, sometimes you have to jump between the webinar tab at the top and the screen share tab at the top. But please, if anyone else is having difficulty seeing the slides, please let me know. Okay, so Just making sure, so moving on to talking about the process of an I-9 audit. An I-9 audit begins with a notice of inspection, and that notice usually gives an employer 3 business days to produce the records that include I-9s and sometimes supporting documentation such as payroll or other relevant records. And it's important for employers to know that if you get a notice like this, first of all, you have the right to hire legal counsel who can advise you and sort of take on a communication role with the ICE agents. And even though there is a minimum of 3 days, you can also request more time. And so it's important that employers don't feel rushed into producing records before you're ready, and that you know that you have a right to retain your own legal representation to represent employer interests. Next slide, please. And then the process can get pretty complex pretty quickly. I know this is probably hard to see, but I'm just going to walk you through it briefly. So once an I-9 notice of inspection is received, okay, actually, you can also take a look if you want to. You can pop in the URL on this slide and follow along a little more clearly. Maybe we can paste that into the chat. There are a lot of steps, and you have the opportunity to, like I said, engage with legal counsel and take your time in responding to this process. I'm a little bit aware of time. I'm concerned that this could become a very long journey. So I think the important thing here to know is that you also have the right to make your employees aware that this notice of inspection has been received, and for employees to be aware that this process is beginning. Thank you for putting that in the chat. If you have a union, which I think might be on the next slide, if your employees have a union in your workplace, the contract may have provisions that address what the employer's commitments in the contract are in this process. But if not, all of these things that can be found in union contracts are certainly policies that any employer can adopt and apply once an audit has a notice of audit has been received. And so under union contracts, things that unions often seek and obtain in a contract is the ability to meet with the employer and with the workers and have a conversation about the I-9 audit process. It also often requires that workers get notification in writing from the employer. And it creates timelines and guidance around creating an opportunity for workers to correct any potential discrepancies that might be identified in the I-9 paperwork with respect to employment authorization. And so even if your workforce doesn't happen to be unionized, there are best practices for employers. They can inform union representatives or employees directly, right? And you can, again, provide proof of that documentation so that workers know exactly what's been asked and at what stage the process is at. You can inform employees about what to expect next, what documentation might be being requested of them. And when in the course of doing this, it's important that your communication is uniform, right? You don't want to be providing information to one segment of workers and not providing that information to another population of workers. And another thing also is to be, in the course of this, best practices are to be mindful of people's privacy and confidentiality, right? So if you're going to provide a notice, you can provide it to everyone, but you also need to provide it in a way that doesn't single people out and doesn't, create mistrust or create a sense that people's information is being disclosed. And again, another practice is being able to provide employees with a reasonable amount of time to correct any documentation if it's been requested or identified as having a discrepancy. And And also perhaps implementing a uniform policy around permissible leaves of absence, when someone might take a leave of absence and then return to the workplace. And of course, compensation, right? Ensuring that if an employee does not provide updated documentation for any reason, that they are compensated for all of the time that they have worked, because we know that all workers, regardless of immigration status, are entitled to compensation for the time that they've worked. Just a few more things. When you're talking with your employees about an audit process, make sure that they know that employees also have a right on their own or as a collectivized workforce in a union to either be speaking to their union representatives or to be speaking with another workers' rights organization. You can remind employees of those constitutional rights that the mayor mentioned at the beginning, right? Workers have a right to remain silent at any stage of inquiry from ICE agents or from any type of law enforcement, right? And also making sure that if and when if discrepancies are identified by an I-9 audit, what the discrepancy is made clear to the employee so that they understand what is being asked of them. Oftentimes, like this paperwork will come through and people are already in a state of stress. And so making sure that the information that you provide is clear and specific. And then finally, I just want to take a minute. There's a lot of information out there for employers related to E-Verify, but making sure that people understand and employers understand that there is no obligation at the federal level right now, generally, to use E-Verify. Some states have adopted certain requirements for certain employers in certain contexts to use E-Verify, but just taking a minute to understand that the E-Verify system itself has been proven to have a lot of errors and racial bias, and so is not necessarily the quickest way to avoiding these problems, and it can in fact create new problems for employers when the system generates potential discrepancies that are not based on work authorization, but then lead to workers missing days of work, business being disrupted, and having the effect overall in the community and on the economy of pushing workers into the underground economy, which hurts our community and our economy overall. So I wanted to just close by saying that, and then I'll pass it over to, I think, Rachel is next.
Thank you, Keely. Everybody, again, these copies of these presentation will be made available on a link at the end of this presentation. So you get all this really great information and links that are in these. I'd like now
Actually,
to,
Frankie, can I, I'm so sorry. There's one other
yes.
thing I wanted to mention. I didn't get a chance to put it on my slide. I also wanted to mention that we have a tool for the community, which is a texting tool. If you text ABQ ICE to 58910, that's a tool that can get you connected to organized power in numbers. And we will be using that resource to provide information for people who might need direct legal service linkage to direct legal assistance, and also to identify potential ICE activity in the community. I'm sorry about that.
No, thank you. That's such a really great resource. I appreciate that. And we'll make that available as well on our resource page so everybody gets it, not just in this presentation. Great. I'm going to now introduce Rachel Lazar. She's the Executive Director of El Centro de Igualdad de Derechos, an organization dedicated to advancing the rights of immigrants and low-wage workers in Albuquerque. With a strong background in advocacy, policy change, and community organizing, Rachel has been instrumental in fighting for fair labor practices, immigrant protections, and economic justice. Rachel's going to be highlighting the rights that all workers, regardless of immigration status, are entitled to. I'm going to hand this over to Rachel.
Great. Thank you so much, Frankie. Really appreciate the invite. And As Frankie mentioned, El Centro is an immigrant rights, civil rights, and worker justice organization, and we've had the privilege of organizing in the community over the past couple decades. And so we were actually around when Albuquerque passed its first immigrant-friendly policy and have seen not only the public safety gains, but we would also make the argument that our policies are good for business. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And Frankie, can you take me to the slide on immigrant contributions, please? There we go. Okay. So we are incredibly proud in New Mexico of the legacy that we built around immigrant integration. And we know that immigrant workers and families are vital to our cultural and economic and the civic fabric of New Mexico. So when we're talking about business and workers, who are we talking about and what is the impact? So immigrants, although only represent about 9% of the population in New Mexico, represent about 11% of the workforce, which really shows, right, the impact, importance of immigrant workers to New Mexico's economy. And we know that immigrant workers work in key sectors, including construction and agriculture. We know we're a big dairy state and a big chili state, as well as in service industries, food services, home healthcare, childcare, and oil and gas. And so a good chunk of our state budget is actually generated by immigrant workers who work in the oil fields. And some of the statistics around, oil and gas added $16.1 billion to New Mexico's GDP. Couldn't do it without the workers, right? Immigrants, 63,000 immigrants are homeowners, right? And pay more than $256 million in rent, right? Pointing out that immigration overall has historically led to better, not worse wages and work opportunities, right? For even native-born citizen workers. And immigrant workers and businesses contributed about $12 billion to New Mexico's economy. And I think it's about 1.3 in local, state, and federal taxes. And I start this off because we know that the reason that you all as business owners are on this webinar is because you care about your business, and we can't have businesses without our workers. So let's go back to the first slide, Frankie. Okay, so Keely did an amazing job from OPIN talking about I-9 audits. What type of ICE activity can we anticipate during this administration? So there's three main things that we can anticipate. One, we already talked about through I-9 audits. Second would be that ICE could show up looking for an individual, and we're going to talk about what your rights are in that situation. But oftentimes they look for an individual, and either that individual is not there, or they are there, and then they do what are called collateral arrests, which means that they can go around and ask other employees about their country of origin and their status. And then the third, which we've been hearing about happening all across the nation, are raids. And that is when ICE would show up in mass, right, and round up as many workers as they can in the workplace. So let's start with our basic rights. And just reminding folks, we're going to talk a little bit about Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights today. And oh, thanks, Frankie. Just to remind folks that these are rights that apply equally regardless of our country of origin or our immigration status. And the Fourth Amendment is really around unreasonable search and seizure by the government. The Fifth Amendment, and we hear it all the time, right? I take the Fifth is our right to remain silent, or the right to protect ourselves from self-incrimination. Okay. We're going to talk about how do we remember that. And we don't expect people when ICE shows up to be remembering which amendment of the Constitution, but an easy way to remind ourselves of that, and for you all to help your employees, is when we're talking about ICE agents, we don't have to open our mouth, the door, or let them into private spaces. Okay, that is an easy way to talk about the Fourth and Fifth Amendment. Next slide, please. Okay, so tips before ICE activity. The biggest one is to make sure you have a plan, right? We shouldn't wait until something happens in our workplace to have a plan. And it should be a company-wide plan or an organization-wide plan. For how to respond to ICE activity, we recommend you appoint at least one person per shift within your company who will know how to respond. And again, they should know about the different types of ICE activity that could take place in their workplace. One simple tip is to clearly mark public versus private spaces. I know there's a question in the chat, which we'll get to from Roadrunner Food Bank about that, and I'd be happy to answer that specific question when we get to Q&A. So clearly mark public versus private spaces. You should have signage that says private or signage that says employees only or no public access. So make sure you have really clear signage. And that can also be in your parking lot. Ensure management and your employees and coworkers know the plan. You can offer Know Your Rights workshops for your employees. And so feel free to contact El Centro if you want a Know Your Rights workshop for your employees. Have access to attorneys. And again, don't wait until there's an issue. So know and attorneys who specialize in both immigration and employment law. And then I already talked about the signage. Next slide, please. Okay, so tips before ICE activity. So ICE needs a search warrant, and that is signed by a judge. Or the owner or a designated supervisor's permission or probable cause that something unlawful or illegal is happening in your workplace in order to enter private spaces. So what does that mean? That means if I have a restaurant, ICE can enter where the public enters, but they can't enter the kitchen. Okay, they can't enter employee-only restrooms. They can't enter office space, but that needs to be very clearly delineated. Also, it's very intimidating when they show up. And so you need to train your folks, right, to ask for a search warrant, okay? It is not enough if they have an arrest warrant, a final order of removal, like a deportation order. It is not enough if they have what's called an ICE detainer, which asks like the local jail to hold someone. It has to be a search warrant. Now, if you can't distinguish, and it is hard to distinguish sometimes, we do training on that, but you will know if they have a search warrant because they will enter by force. So that is one sign that they have a search warrant. Otherwise, folks should practice saying, you cannot enter, you do not have permission to enter my business, you do not have permission to enter private spaces, okay? If approached by an officer trying to enter a work site or a private space, workers need to be advised that they have the right to say, I can't give you permission to enter. You must speak with my employer or supervisor, and managers should be trained to do the same thing. Workers can state that. They can also continue to work, okay? I told you there were 3 different situations that ICE can enter private spaces. One is with the search warrant. Second is with permission of management or a supervisor or the owner. The third is with probable cause. Probable cause includes if people, for example, panic and run back to the kitchen, that is enough probable cause then for ICE to enter that private space. Okay, so learn what a search warrant looks like. Make sure that if they have a search warrant that you limit their search to what is listed on the warrant. Okay, tips during ICE activity. We already talked about the I-9 audit. We already talked about your point person. You also have the right to ask officers for their name, badge numbers, and for whom they work. We have been hearing a lot of rumor in Albuquerque, right, about ICE activity. And oftentimes it's not ICE, it's other law enforcement that is doing their everyday work. And so ask the question to make sure you know who you're talking to. You can take note of the color of uniforms, logos, what do their vehicles look like if they're marked, and document that while the activity is happening. Your workers have the right to continue to work and refuse to talk to ICE officials. They don't need to show ID. They don't need to divulge their country of origin and or their immigration status. Even divulging one's country of origin is enough for ICE to temporarily detain and interrogate someone, and it shifts the burden onto that individual to prove they are in the country legally. When people remain silent, right, the burden is upon the officer to find probable cause. Okay, you have the right to film the activity to ensure nobody's rights are being violated, so you can use your cell phone. There could be consequences if you actively impede or interfere with an arrest. Okay, you can also identify any workers who've been detained if you have their names, their date of birth, and what's called their A number. That's their alien number. If it's available, and I'll talk to you about the importance of that on the next slide. Okay, so if you have that information, you can help people. The first step is usually helping people find their loved one, okay? And that, I think, Opine just talked about a resource. Organizations such as the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center, El Centro, the Mexican Consulate has a hotline that you can call to see if they can help identify where that person has been detained. It's incredibly scary when children get home and their parents are not there. It is incredibly scary for parents when family members are missing, and sometimes they don't know where people are being detained. We talked about having your attorneys on speed dial. You can also send a legal team to the nearby ICE holding facility. Okay, the attorneys can demand to see the detained workers depending on how long they're held at the processing center. They can interview them for additional information about how the detention or raid took place. You can talk to impacted family members, give them know your rights information, referrals to attorneys. You can refer them to our organizations for support. We have something in Albuquerque called the ABQ Immigrant Rights Network that we organize. And it is dozens of organizations who are coordinating, talking to each other, and sharing resources. You can raise money so the impacted family member can explore posting bond with their attorney. And then you can also explore if social pressure or advocacy by members of Congress would be helpful. Next slide, please. Okay. The other thing is, if the workers are unionized, contact the union rep. And then you can also contact a local workers justice organization such as El Centro as well to learn more about the workers' rights and get referrals to important resources. So employer obligations and work protections, ensure that your workers get paid for all the time worked. So if there's an I-9 audit and people either quit, right, or they can no longer continue to be employed in that workplace, you need to make sure that they get paid for all of their time worked. Remember, we have some of the strongest anti-wage theft legislation in the country, which includes treble damages and a 3-year statute of limitation, and even longer if wage theft is continuous. So make sure that worker gets paid for all of their time. Make sure workers are afforded all non-mandatory benefits as well. So let's say you have a policy that someone gets cashed out their paid time off or paid sick leave, that needs to be afforded to that worker as well. And then ensure that firing and hiring practices do not violate any of our federal and state statutes, including the New Mexico Human Rights Act, right? So all of this uncertainty that's going on should not lead to decision-making around not hiring people or firing people based on their national origin. Okay, so I think that is my section, and I will be answering some questions and answers. So thank you for the opportunity. We look forward to continued collaboration with the City of Albuquerque, decades long, and we hope to be a resource to all of you as well as to how to protect your workforce. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. We appreciate everything you've done here for us. I do want to let everybody know that as attendees that this looks like it'll go a little bit past the hour mark. We have a ton of information. We do want to honor everybody's questions to get answered live here. So if you guys want to hang out with us, we're going to go a little bit past the top of the hour. And we're just going to touch briefly, as this webinar is about businesses, we're going to touch briefly about commercial landlords and tenants' rights and responsibilities. So we're just going to go a little bit on commercial spaces. If you are a commercial landlord or if you're a tenant who is leasing a space in a commercial space. Fair housing and business leasing protections. While the Fair Housing Act applies mostly to residential leases, New Mexico's Unfair Practices Act protects against discrimination in commercial transactions, including leases. Albuquerque offers additional local protections and resources for tenants. We are an immigrant-friendly city resolution. It was Resolution 18.7 in 2018. Our city council reaffirmed Albuquerque as a safe place for immigrants, as well as war refugees, people of color, and people with disabilities. This resolution emphasized the city's dedication to supporting vulnerable communities, maintaining their quality of life, which also resonates back to their leasing and landlords of spaces. Non-cooperation with these immigrant enforcement, that we aim to foster trust between immigrant communities and local authorities, ensuring that residents feel safe accessing city services without fear of deportation. So a little bit of what landlords cannot do. They cannot discriminate based on immigration status. They cannot even ask for immigration status or documents. And they cannot evict tenants due to their immigration status or fear of immigration status. But what they can do is they can verify eligibility for specific programs, whether it be housing or commercial. They can request documentation for lease purposes, and they can also conduct lawful business operations. I have here, we have Chuck Sheldon standing by, Chuck Sheldon, CCIM of TNC Management. If anybody has any questions relating to commercial spaces, he'll be on deck in a little bit to answer any questions. So here's resources for everybody. These are all linked, so everybody can have access to them on their website afterwards. These are just some local resources, our office, the Office of Equity and Inclusion. And if anyone needs assistance, here's some resources we've put together. All community members are invited to participate in these free upcoming anonymous events. We have them here at this link, so feel free to reach out. We also have a QR code here to this website. If anybody wants to take out their phones, they can get a link to all of these webinars coming up for the next month. I'll leave this up for a second, but we're going to now answer the questions from the Q&A box. We again have Chuck Sheldon from TNC Management, as well as Rachel, and Keely, who can cover workplace rights and hiring practices. So I'm going to hand it off back to Rachel, and if you want to take a first of the questions and answer them for everybody.
Yeah, and Frankie, could you give me permission to turn my video back on, please? There we go. That way people can put a face to the voice. Okay, so let's go into the Q&A. And some of these I am going to actually ask Keely to answer. But number one, what is to prevent an employer from calling ICE the day before he or she is due to pay employees? And so there is nothing preventing that from happening, but they would have to replace their employees and workforce. So it wouldn't make much business sense to do that. B, we have some of, again, the strongest wage theft laws in the nation. So they would still have to pay the workers that they called ICE on. And thirdly, Keely explained that you cannot knowingly hire people without work authorization. So calling ICE on all of your workers might indicate that you knowingly hired unauthorized workers. So from those three different perspectives, wouldn't make sense, but yes, could happen. Oh, and just also to mention, part of our anti-wage theft legislation has really strong anti-retaliation language. And so that business could also be in violation of the anti-retaliation part of the wage theft legislation. And Keely, when you speak, if you have anything else to add, go for it. I'm going to go to question number 2. It says, I work for Roadrunner Food Bank. We are seeking advice related to ICE showing up in an outdoor food distribution. What should we do? And how can we advise our partners who host outdoor food distributions? So a couple things that you can do. You can put clear signage, right? Even in parking lots that says, customers only or clients only. You could put a physical barrier, right? And have someone outside that allows people only after they've identified themselves to go into that space. So there are things that you can do that will indicate that those are private spaces. And this is also where training your employees, right? So if ICE were to show up and you have clients outside, you can remind those clients about their right to remain silent, that they don't have to answer questions, etc. Third one is a question around asking about businesses following the law and asking if Albuquerque's government has to as well. And of course, so city and state governments have to follow the law as well. That applies to I-9 as well. And I think the question might have been around immigrant-friendly policy. So our policies are actually absolutely in line with federal law. So immigration is under the sole purview of the federal government. And so our local policies are constitutional as well. Keely, do you want to answer the question? I think I did already, but can the city get an I-9 audit?
Yeah, this is a federal work authorization. It requires, it's a universal requirement that if you're an employer, that you complete I-9 to ensure that the people you're employing are work authorized. So it's certainly possible.
Okay, and then Keely, I am going to have you answer the next 2 questions as well. One being employers can, but are they required to notify their workforce? And I think that was a question specific to notifying their workforce during an I-9 audit.
Yeah, I think we are advising that it's a best practice, right? We think that providing that information is best practice for both the employer and the employee. Separate from if there's a legal obligation, which there may not be, but I think our point in this presentation is that it's in both the employer and the worker interest to be on the same page about what documents are being sought, at what stage of a process is the audit.
Thank you, Keely. Next question for you as well is it true that once you start to use E-Verify, you must always use E-Verify permanently?
I think not to my knowledge, as a general matter, I try and point out potential pitfalls of E-Verify because, again, it has been shown to not always be effective, to create discrepancies that are not reflective of people's actual work authorization, and then that causes slowdowns for employers. But that being said, I think there's a mechanism that employers can use to withdraw from participation. But even more importantly than that, I think the thing to emphasize, besides what I just said, is that you have to be cautious about any type of selective use of that tool, right? Yeah.
Great. The next one, I am not sure if I understand it. Keely, I'm going to ask if you do. If not, we'll ask the person to please put some more specificity. It says if workers feel their employers are violating privacy laws, what can they do? Who should they contact?
I mean, I think my overall, I'm not sure particularly what you're referencing there, but if I'm thinking that perhaps when I was talking about people talking about kind of engaging around an I-9 audit and around all of these policies uniformly, right? You don't want to be communicating with employees in a way where you're treating people differently. And so if you're going to provide this information, you want to provide it uniformly, right? And so if people are feeling that there is uneven ways of engagement that workers or employees are experiencing, I mean, first and foremost, if there's a workplace union, always going to the union, right? I think that's a great resource for workers. Another resource is worker centers, right? And then workers can also speak with employment attorneys, right? Any worker always has the first and foremost, I guess, that, obviously I recognize that this is a community of employers. So making sure that you have clear communication and lines of communication so that if your employee has a concern internally, they have a process where they can raise that concern, right? But beyond place of employment, some other resources are places like worker centers and private employment attorneys.
Okay, thank you so much, Keely. So let's move on. And then Frankie, you tell me as soon as we need to cut off, but this is great. These are great questions. Next one says, I have a question towards small businesses utilizing public space. Do they have protection? So again, ICE or any law enforcement official can go anywhere that the public has access to. So the protection is really in educating your employees, or if you have patients, customers, clients, etc., right? Being very clear about the right to remain silent and not having, if you see ICE activity taking place in public spaces, reminding people about their right to remain silent. Okay, does the city have a policy for its public facilities like community centers? It says we operate a public event on city property. We have a right to refuse service to anyone. Would that apply to ICE? So again, the answer would be exactly the same, right? Around ICE having the ability to enter anywhere that the public does. But yes, the fact that you say right to refuse service to anybody, you could take the step and try to demand a search warrant. And can't guarantee that that will be respected, but it would be an important step to take. Next, I provide in-home services to children in their home. What do I need to tell my staff if they're present in the home during an ICE raid? Okay, so in our homes, we talk about our homes like a sanctuary space in the sense that we have a very high expectation in our homes of privacy. And so what you should do is talk to your employees about the fact that they do not need to open the door. Once you open the door, right, you are making yourself more vulnerable, right? And it can be incredibly intimidating. And so folks have the right to keep their door closed. If someone opens the door, that individual still has the right to deny entry and be very clear, right, that they don't have the right to enter without a search warrant. And in addition to that, individuals do not have to show when you're in your home any type of identification, divulge anything about their country of origin, or divulge anything about whether or not anything about their immigration status. Okay, so I think we got through all the questions. I would be happy, first of all of our Know Your Rights information. As of this afternoon, we're updating our website. You will have an updated one-pager. If you go to El Centro de Igualdad y Derechos' website, all this information will be on our website. You can also reach us at 505-246 1627. I feel free to put that in the chat. And yes, if we can't answer questions, we work with a whole amazing team of people, including immigration attorneys, as well as employment attorneys. So if you all have questions that we can't answer, we are happy to put you in touch with the right people.
Thank you, Rachel. I did want to address a question that we've had multiple times come through our small business office. If a tenant is deported and their name is on the lease, can someone else continue renting the unit if they're not listed as the primary leaseholder? Chuck Sheldon did an amazing answer here, and I'd just like him to come back on and to possibly share and maybe go in a little bit more depth to answer that. Can you hear us, Chuck?
I can hear you. Can you
Okay.
hear me?
We can.
All right. I think everybody's done an amazing job identifying the key issues, about privacy. And I went to the National Apartment Association to pull up their direction under these situations. The question specifically, if somebody is renting and you have them on the lease and they're taken by ICE and let's say deported, then, they're not here and nobody can actually step into their shoes under that lease. So you have to change the lease and actually save their property and put their property away for 30 days and store it. Find out who's the next legal representative that they have, and you can provide that material to them. But you can't sublease under those folks. That changes the nature of the lease.
Awesome.
Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you, Chuck. I appreciate it for going into detail. I have pulling up the contact us page for all of these amazing individuals who've been here on today. And so feel free to, copy anything like that of emails or phone numbers. And they are willing to answer any questions that you all may have. And so with that, I just want to thank you all for attending today's presentation. If you do have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to the organizations here. And this presentation will be made available to download on their website. And you can scan that QR code for information. We thank you all for your time and appreciate your commitment to supporting Albuquerque's immigrant and small business communities. Thank you all.
Thank you, Frankie, for hosting this.
Thank you.